Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show. We have got a fascinating guest today. His name is Bob Woodson. He founded the Woodson Center, or what would become the Woodson Center, about 40 years ago. He won something called the Genius Grant. Okay, I'm paying attention now. You won something called the Genius Grant from the MacArthur Center? Okay, well, let's figure this out. Bob Woodson created a project in response to the 1619 Project. This is timely. The 1619 Project won the Pulitzer Prize today, and yet it's full of errors. Not only is it full of errors, a number of history professors came out against it for not being factual. Bob's even more critical. He says, race grievance mongers are being allowed to make a profit center out of racial grievance. And then he holds them further to the fire, saying that their approach makes it as if black folk are incapable of self-control and dependent upon white people as saviors. He's like, that's patronizing, and I reject that. What we're going to do is start something called 1776. 1776unites.com is where you go look this up. The Woodson Center, you can go woodsоncenter.org. You can learn all about that. The 1776 Project takes academics who look at the actual founding of our country instead of this date of 1619, which is at best a creative approach to establishing the founding of our country. And they say, nope, it's 1776. It's founded on a dream, on ideals, on principles of freedom. And they would rather celebrate that than to go the other route. I don't want to steal Bob's thunder because he says it way better than I do. We also, in this episode, have Dr. Will Reilly, who's become a regular on this show because he is thought-provoking and he is doing really, really big things. Look for more from him. He is constantly challenging norms and backing it up with data. I know you're going to love what Will and what Bob bring to the show. It's really exciting to have these guys here. We'll be doing more with the 1776 Project as they try to create opportunity out of the founding of our country instead of looking at this, again, race mongering. Okay, let's get past that and let's talk about the show real quick. Hey, we provide a lot of different subjects and topics. We might talk about COVID-19 because that's relevant right now. We might talk about the Pulitzer Prize winning 1619 Project versus 1776. We might talk about Hall of Fame MMA fighters. You just never know. The Break It Down show provides an array of guests with, a pedigree of success that I'll put up against any show. That's what you're listening to when you get into us. Subscribe, rate, review, and let me know who else you want to have on the show. I guarantee you we'll put you on a good ride. All right, it's been a little long-winded here. Let me go ahead and just say this one last thing. Save the Brave, savethebrave.org. That is our charity. We back them up, and every day there are veterans killing themselves. What we do at Save the Brave, we try to make that stop. We try to get veterans involved in community with themselves, get them reaching back and investing in one another, and hopefully stop this scourge. All right, here comes the incredible Bob Woodson.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is Bob Woodson, and you're listening to the Break It Down show.
Yeah, Bob's here with me with Dr. Will Reilly. We're going to be talking about the 1776 project that the Woodson Center has put together. And I guess I'll just turn it over to you, Will. Why are we talking to Bob Woodson?
Well, yeah, Bob Woodson is a guy who founded an initiative that I'm actually pretty happy, pretty proud to be a part of, which is 1776, which began, to some extent, as a response from the Black scientific or business or just personal responsibility focused community to the 1619 Project that was promoted by the New York Times. So, I mean, Pete, as I understand, you wanted to talk to a number of the people that are involved with 1776. So we've got Talib Starks, as I understand, is going to do one of these Break It Down shows.
Yes.
I've been on. I've contacted Glenn Lowry, Carol Swain, Coleman Hughes. I can't speak for every one of those people, but I'd like to get a range of different 1776 perspectives out there. And just kicking it off from the top, I mean, Bob, what does 1776 mean to you? Or I guess a more detailed question, what would you say are the differences between the 1776 initiative's vision and the vision of the 1619 project, which I think most middle-class Americans have heard a lot more about lately? What is 1776?
Well, 1619 really is an attempt on the part of a group of elite academic blacks conspiring with the New York Times to rewrite American history, to define America as racist from the beginning, to say it was founded, that the real birthday of America is not 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but 1619. That's the time, the date when the first slaves, Black African slaves, came into America. And then they go on to really denigrate the history of America and say, because some of the founders owned slaves, therefore the Declaration of Independence that they wrote was therefore flawed. And because of the people writing it perhaps were not deserving of its principles. And so what they have done in essence is said that America is forever flawed and therefore is racism in its DNA, and that Black America is America's perpetual victim, and that all of the problems that we're witnessing today in Black communities with the 70% out of wedlock birth, violence, Black on Black crime, we have a 9/11 every 6 months in Black America, and that all of those problems are related to a legacy of slavery and discrimination. And the only answer to that problem is reparations. And what's so lethal about that, what it says to Black America, particularly low-income Blacks, is that you are incapable of self-control, and therefore your destiny is determined by what white people will do for you and with you, because you've got no agency yourself. And that is a lethal weapon to give people an exemption from personal responsibility, to say you are exempt. If you're killing one another, if you're destroying yourself, it is not your fault. And it's really patronizing and really an expression of white supremacy to say to Black people that your destiny is determined by white people who we acknowledge that does not like you. And so that's what's very dangerous. So what we're offering is an alternative narrative to really challenge the assumptions there with facts in history. In other words, when whites were at their worst during slavery and discrimination, Blacks were at their best. That we maintained solid two-parent households even during slavery, and for 100 years following slavery, Black Americans did not, succumb to oppression.
Is it possible that we're looking at this from a different perspective, that maybe this 1619 folks aren't looking at it? Dr. Reilly, I know that you've talked a lot about this part, but there's a lot of racial groups that come here to the United States and do fantastically well. There's people that bet their entire life. They come here with, how many times we've heard the story of my father came here with some number less than $5 in their pocket, and they somehow made it. That does not sound like a bigoted country to me. That sounds like a unique opportunity. People are getting on flotillas of garbage to come here from places like Cuba. They're willing to risk their lives in a shipping container coming here from a place like China. These things happen all the time. Why are we doing such a poor job with the Black community, I guess, is my question to you, Dr. Reilly.
Well, I think there are a couple things there. So one of the things I say in my writing is that the success of Black immigrants is a complete counter, not just to theories that racism is everywhere in the modern USA, but also to quote unquote alt-right theories of genetic supremacy and that sort of thing. If you look at really the 18 or 20 most successful groups in the USA, I mean, whites certainly do quite well, and I'm an anti-racist. I have no problem with that. But as I recall, number one in terms of household income is Indian Americans, mostly dark-skinned, quote-unquote, Dravins from the southern part of the Indian subcontinent. Nigerians are in the top 3 or 4. That's obviously a purely Black group. Most Black Americans have ancestors that actually came from that region of West Africa. That's where the slaves were sold from. Filipino Americans, Japanese Americans, West Indians were also Black. So it seems to me that there's no real way to argue that the problems of Black Americans are due, primarily at least, or entirely to racism, when you've got these Black immigrant groups, Jamaicans in the same city, that are doing better than Black and white people. There's something else there. And I think Bob would identify that as cultural, as character-based, even as religious in a lot of cases. And I don't think I disagree with that. One of the things that's interesting here, coming from kind of that center-right perspective on my end, is that a lot of the problems in the Black community don't date back to slavery. If you look at the work of Walter Williams, right-leaning economist, he points out over and over and over again that in 1938, for example, the Black illegitimacy rate was 10%, 11%. Whites were doing even better. And again, I don't have a problem with that. Good for both groups. It was 4%, I believe, for Caucasians. But that transition, so maybe that gap between 10 and 5 is due to racial prejudice. But the increase of 1,000% from 10 or 11% to 70+% over the past 40 years, that has nothing to do with historical racism. It logically can't, which I guess segues into my next question. For you, Bob, what do you think caused these issues in the Black community? This may be a bit of a softball, but if it wasn't slavery that's responsible for this recent upsurge in crime that we saw in, the pre-Giuliani 80s and 90s, this upsurge in illegitimacy, drug abuse, that applies to whites as well. What caused it?
Well, first of all, pathology was never associated with poverty. Being poverty did not mean that you were going to rob somebody or steal from other people. If you look at the history of Black America, as we did with a series of essays, at the end of when there were, they look at the records of 6 plantations. What was the family composition of the slaves when they left slavery? 70% had a man and a woman raising children. We were only 25% of Blacks who were released from slavery, freed from slavery, were literate. In less than 40 years, that number rose to 75%. There were 20 slaves people who were born into slavery who died millionaires. Right? And so, we always had an attitude of moral competence. In the 1930 and 1940, when the unemployment rate during the Depression was 40% for whites, 30% for whites, it was 45% for Blacks, we had the highest marriage rate of any group in America. Elderly people could walk safely in their neighborhoods without being fearful of being mugged by their grandchildren. And this cultural cohesion created by our Christian values and the sanctity of 2-parent households was what helped us to weather the storm of racism and discrimination. Even our incarceration rates up until 1960 was only about 25 to 30%. And as you say, in Ohio, people say, well, because of racism and Jim Crow and redlining, we couldn't achieve. In Ohio, in the Brownsville section of Chicago, you're from Chicago.
Yep.
In 1929, there were 731 owned Black businesses. We had 100 million in real estate assets, and the out of wedlock birth was less than 10%. And that was considered a scandal. And I could take you from city after city to demonstrate that our response to discrimination wasn't to wallow in victimhood, but it was to engage in enterprise and build our own railroad in Baltimore, Maryland in 1868, when 1,000 Blacks were fired from the docks of we successfully operated a railroad, the Chesapeake, Maine Dry Dock and Railroad Company, for 18 years from Maine to Baltimore. Same with hotels, the Wallahaji in Atlanta, the St. Teresa in New York, the St. Charles in Ohio, and Chicago. I could go on and on and on. So we had a rich heritage. We didn't destroy ourselves with Black on Black crime. It took the poverty programs following the civil rights movement that really caused us to fall off the cliff morally and spiritually and descend into this quagmire that we're in now. It's only about 50 to 60 years old. It has nothing to do with slavery or discrimination. It has to do with corrupt social policies that injured poor blacks with the helping hand.
So then my question back is, why did it target blacks disproportionately than, say, other groups?
It didn't really target. What happened, if you go read Siegel's book, Fred Siegel's book, is called America, The Future Once Happened Here. And in that book, he carefully talks about how in the 60s, it was considered welfare, being on welfare was a stereotype. You didn't, in the black community, nobody wanted to be on welfare. There were two social scientists, Piven and Cloward at the University of Columbia University School of Social Work. And these were socialists. They said, well, if we can separate work from income and then flood the system with welfare recipients, what we can do is demonstrate the moral inconsistency of capitalism. And so when the Watts riot occurred, they said, Black community is a perfect group. And so what they did was they began to recruit people into welfare, but the federal government helped by opening offices and recruiting people into the welfare system. But in order to overcome the stereotype, they had to redefine the stigma, destigmatize it. So they called it they moved from social insurance to reparations. And the nuclear family was redefined as being Eurocentric and therefore racist. The women's movements have got behind it because they wanted to make the father redundant. The Black Power movement got behind it. So you had a combination of social forces, government policies that encourage people to come on welfare. So within 4 years, millions of blacks flooded into the welfare system in major cities at a time when the unemployment rate for black men in New York was just 4%. And what the Cloward and Piven and the socialist scientists predicted became true. You saw an out-of-wedlock birth, school dropout, drug addiction, crime, fatherless homes. So that's the cause of it.
One comment I'd add here. I think one of the only ways in which race played into this is probably that black people were more vulnerable to the appeal of these programs than whites, because due to past conflict with whites, due to past oppression, we were, at least to some extent, a poorer community. But I do think that as this pitch continued over the years, we're now seeing a lot of these problems move well beyond the black community. One of the big ones for me as a man, frankly, is illegitimacy, fatherlessness. And that is now an American national problem, where the illegitimacy rate, if I recall this correctly, is 35 to 36% for whites. It's more than 50%, I know, for all Hispanics, including white Hispanics. It's over 60% for Native Americans. It's a bit over 70% for African Americans. So we might have been the first group that was targeted. We were in the big cities. We tended to be working class rather than upper middle class. Socialists have always found the black community appealing. Also, it's the idea that it's the American proletariat. But a lot of this stuff, once it got started, didn't stop with the black community. I don't have my Stata models in front of me, but I'd be very curious about what the welfare use rate, if you're talking about food stamps, Section 8, what used to be called AFDC, WIC, what that is across all communities, because there's been a staggering upsurge in that since the 1960s and 70s. I mean, being on welfare used to make you, even when I was a kid to some extent, the object of ridicule. And there have been decades of individuals consciously attempting to change that, and it's worked.
But, I want to make this point, too. Our detractors will say, well, you're saying racism doesn't exist. No, racism does exist. It is a problem, but not the central problem. An example that I give, if white people were to disappear tomorrow and go to Europe and Canada, how would it affect the out-of-wedlock births? How would it affect the black-on-black crime? How would it affect the way we're abusing ourselves with our diet? And so it is important to make that point that we're not discounting that racism has nothing to do, but it is a problem, but it is not the most important problem, is that Black America is suffering from an enemy that was is within. And the 1619, these black elite scholars blow my mind, because you had a guy named Robert Smalls, who was born a slave in 1839 in Sumter, South Carolina. And he was on a supply ship, and he commandeered the ship and put on a hat and came through 5 garrisons, and then turned the ship over to the Union Navy. And the Congress gave him a $1,500 reward and made him an officer in the Navy, and it caused President Lincoln to allow blacks to fight in the Civil War. Well, he went after the war. He became a successful businessman and a member of Congress during Reconstruction. He went back and purchased a plantation on which he was a slave and took in the children of the slave owner that had become destitute. So here is an act of radical grace on the part of somebody, and yet there are blacks with PhDs making 6-figure incomes angrier than Robert Smalls was, and he was a slave.
Let's go back to those elite scholars. If they're going to put this out, and the New York Times is going to, back it up, why get so many facts, actual facts, wrong?
And afterwards,
afterwards, and not just Europeans.
No, not just European. I mean, first of all, slavery didn't end for the British Empire until 50 years after that. I mean, there were slaveries around. So for them to claim that somehow the Civil War, that the war for independence was fought to free slavery, against slavery, defending slavery, is not true, since the British Empire maintained slaves for 50 years after. But they're not interested in facts. What they have is it's indoctrination. That's why when those 5 or 6 historians presented a rebuttal to the New York Times, Nicole Hannah-Jones dismissed them as being white. That's why it is important for our 1776 effort to be black-led, but participating, but welcomed all. Because these are some successful black folks standing up and said, you do not speak for us.
One thing that I would chip in there, I mean, Pete, in terms of your question, how could they have gotten so many things wrong? First of all, I think Bob did a great overview of some of them. I mean, 1619 flatly claimed that the U.S. Revolutionary War was fought to preserve slavery. That figure is absolutely correct. Slavery didn't end really anywhere in the world for 40, 50 years, 52 years after the Revolutionary War. It's worth noting that all of the great black kingdoms of Africa, Ghana, Songhai, Mali had slaves. The Arab states had slaves. Russia, chattel serfdom, the Euros had slaves. Slavery was a universal human institution, so that's ignored. But just a number of other things. I mean, they claimed that slavery was responsible in large part for the wealth of the United States. If you actually look at analyses in economic or historical journals, I mean, slavery made the South into a feudal backwater. They were doing the sort of medieval agriculture with peons that you've captured in the war, pulling plows that much of the world was abandoning specifically by that point. Plantation owners, I'm sure, felt like powerful boss men. But I mean, if you look at one of the reasons the South lost the Civil War was that in 1860, something like 90% of the manufacturing capacity, the physical plant in the USA, was located in the North. So, I mean, that is factually false. At one point, they say that 12.5 million Africans were taken from Africa during the Middle Passage slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. What they ignore is the fact that only about 400,000 came to the USA. Most of the rest were sold to other nations like Brazil, many of which would be in our terms minority-headed. So anyway, blah, blah, blah. But yes, they get a lot of things wrong. I think that a big part of that is that social justice scholarship just isn't that good. This is kind of my bias as an academic. But I mean, to make these claims that the USA, one of the greatest countries in history, is uniquely evil, or whites have a bloodier history than, say, people from Ashanti or Mongolia, or to say a lot of things like this, you have to ignore a huge amount of the truth. You keep seeing these, we call them so-called hoaxes in academia. I mean, as someone I follow on Twitter, Helen Pluckrose and a couple of her buddies sent a series of ridiculous papers into the top journals in social science, and they were almost all accepted. One of them was just a chapter of Mein Kampf from Hitler that was presented as a guide to ideal government. One of them One of them was a paper on quote unquote fat bodybuilding, arguing that no matter how out of shape you are, you should be allowed to compete in competitions like the Olympics. The funniest one was an examination of gender roles at dog parks, where they pretended to have done an analysis of whether male dogs are more likely to hump your leg. And they tried to link this to quote unquote rape culture. So a lot of this stuff is just a long-winded answer to you gentlemen's intelligent comments, but a lot of this stuff is just garbage. There's not really, when you look at claims about things like white fragility, there's never a supporting basis of evidence. I've never seen a paper that shows that whites get angrier if you call them racist and idiots than, say, blacks would if you called us criminals or something like that. It doesn't exist in reality. It exists just to support a narrative very often.
One of the papers argued from an educator, now she's that somehow because of the racism that and the experiments that were done on slaves, that physicians today administer painkillers at a different level to blacks they do whites because blacks are more resistant to pain. And that's supposed to have its origins in studies. And she says, but there were 2 studies. No one said which studies. I mean, it's so ridiculous of what they're doing. And the very fact that the New York Times, Random House is going to be doing some books, and there are other companies that are the Pulitzer Institute is making study guides, and they're going to they have targeted 3,000 schools where they're underperforming black kids. And what kind of message are we going to be sending in September to those kids? We're going to say to a 10-year-old that you live in a country that is your enemy and that racism is in the DNA of the country, and therefore you stand no chance. You have little control over your future. And then if that child is going to be bombarded with that kind of dogma for 8 years, and then America is going to say to this 18-year-old, we need you to defend us. Why would a child want to defend a country that he's been raised to hate? Or become a member of law enforcement right now, because people on the left have denigrated law enforcement in America. Every time you hear about a police officer shooting a white child or a young person, and it's only a limited times that it happens, it becomes front page news. And as a consequence, we have police nullification, where the police are reluctant to engage aggressively in reducing crime. And in St. Louis last summer, you had 14 kids below the age of 14 who were murdered and only 1 person arrested. And 60% of police departments cannot recruit. There's a 62% reduction in recruits going to become police officers. So this is not an isolated issue. This is a matter of the health of this nation is at risk if we allow the race grievance mongers to create profit centers out of racial grievance. And that's what they're doing. They're creating profit centers out of racial grievance.
It's interesting, the United States was, I project the whole racism is in our DNA because the country is founded on an idea, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness hasn't been a part of any kind of founding document. We've got 3 basic forms of freedom, personal, political, and national freedom, protected by our 3 big documents, Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. That doesn't sound, and it's a well of great people coming here and saying, sliding their chips across the table and saying, again, I'll outwork my problems, right? I mean, I don't know of another country where that's possible. And then we're also one of the very few countries in the world, and not the only one, but very few, where if you call the police, you have a reasonable expectation that they will not only show up, but they will put themselves between harm and you. And that is, fellas, that is exceptionally rare in the world to know that that's coming. The person doesn't know you, and they will protect you. So I think that's our DNA. much more so than any kind of racial. Of course, we have racial problems. That's one of the problems of diversity, right? We have all these different people coming in. It's hard to get us all to go in the same direction. We can all point at Denmark, but Denmark is very homogenous when it comes to its racial makeup and ethnicity.
But not only that, under communism, it's against the law to help your neighbor, because that's the responsibility of the state. And under socialism, I remember I was a guest for about a week in Oslo, Norway, some years ago, where officials wanted to learn about volunteerism because it was virtually unknown in those socialist countries, because you assumed if a neighbor had a problem, the government has a cure for it. But in America, deep in the DNA of America, is America just spontaneously responding, as you saw in Katrina. What I love to use the Cajun Navy. This is a group of Cajun New Orleans boaters who, when there's a disaster, FEMA is not the first group on the scene. It's the Cajun Navy. These are volunteers who come out, risk their lives to pluck people off of rooftops and provide comfort for them. And it is spreading. And same with any disaster. That's the cultural norms in America, is to respond to a need. I saw a cop yesterday on his knees on a highway changing a tire for a woman, and it just said, boy, there's an example of America at work at its finest.
We also have a couple of hospital ships in our warlike Navy that will go anywhere and provide comfort and mercy and help. You know, not many countries have that capacity and just push it forward like, hey, we'll desalinate water for you for as long as we can to help out. That is not a racial DNA thing. That is a nation of folks that, yeah, they do want to help each other.
Yeah,
you name another country on the face of the earth that has an Emancipation Proclamation that fought a war to end slavery. I'd like to name one other that did that. We are the only ones who did that.
Hey, this is Pete A. Turner from Lions Rock Productions. We create podcasts around here, and if you, your brand, or your company want to figure out how to do a podcast, just talk to me. I'll give you the advice on the right gear, the best plan, and show you how to take a podcast that makes sense for you, that's sustainable, that's scalable, and fun. Hit me up at pete@breakitdownshow.com. Let me help. I want to hear about it.
We are the only ones who did that. So
yeah, I mean, there's a lot in America's DNA. I mean, I think that I don't want to be insensitive with this, but one of the things I would say is that racism was almost ancillary to, or almost a sideline of, the American founding. And what I mean by that is that when almost all nations in the world were racist in the technical sense, when slavery was legal and when most traditions involved hostility to outsiders, the same thing was true of the United States. So, I mean, when slavery was legal, the United States had slaves. When there were conflicts between the great human populations, when blacks and whites and natives encountered each other, the USA participated in those fights. But that, by definition, is not what made America unique, because everybody did that. Slavery was a global universal. What made America unique was that we were the first large modern democracy, really. I mean, if you're talking to a group of students about what makes America unique, we're the first democracy. It's the first line in a lot of history books. I hope it still is. We're also the destination democracy. We welcome immigrants. We're the capitalist democracy. But this is part of the kind of the lexicon you would teach people. I mean, what made us unique was the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, down the road, the Emancipation Proclamation, because those were the things that we did that nobody else did. And there are also some negative things in our DNA. I don't even know if this is negative. I'm a gun owner. In fact, train people to use weapons. But I mean, we have one of the higher firearm ownership is a good thing, but we also have one of the higher crime rates in the civilized world. They're negative, unique features of American life. But racism is not in the DNA, unique feature of American life by definition, because everyone is capable of racism. Pete, as you've mentioned, I mean, racism is a characteristic of large, diverse societies. Yeah. Diversity has a lot of advantages, but I mean, you have to train people to get along. The Romans had the idea everyone has to look up at the eagle and smile. You need a shared civic identity, and then diversity becomes a positive. But yeah, racism itself is not unique to America. It's not something invented by America. It's not what makes America stand out from France or South Africa or 100 other countries where blacks and whites sometimes fight. A quick final comment on this. One of the other things you notice with the political left is the redefinition of almost everything as racism. So, I mean, Bob mentioned this idea that it is racist that doctors will prescribe fewer painkillers to African Americans. And it's worth looking at that in perspective. I mean, one of the biggest 5 problems in the country is the opiate epidemic, which kills about 100,000 people, almost entirely poor whites, on an annual basis. So if you're saying doctors perceive black people as brave, athletic warriors, and they don't give us poison as much, that's racism. You have to ask, what's the solution to that? Do you want more poison in the black community? You see these kind of redefinitions all the time. Perceiving Asian Americans as smart or black Americans as athletic, that's racism. And a cynic might say that it's essential for the left to do this because as actual racism vanishes, you need to replace it with something to continue the programs that are based around racism.
Well, the racism is also used by the planter class, the plantation owners, to keep poor whites in place too. Because they didn't have the franchise, they couldn't vote, only property owners could vote. They didn't have much education. No one writes about what happened to poor whites in the South. There was an attempt to organize poor whites against slavery because they are the ones who had most to lose from it. But what the planters did was give them race as an antidote to that. The way a lot of on the left try to anesthetize low-income blacks in these urban centers by using race, so that they won't have to ask the question, why, if racism were the problem, then why are black children failing in school systems, social service systems run by their own people?
Well, this gets into the...
Why are blacks being miseducated in institutions by their own people? But to prevent that kind of question being raised, we can always say, well, it's institutional racism. Somehow white people are armed with a remote control device that causes professional blacks to miseducate their children in institutions run by them. If we can just get hold of that device they have, then our problems will be solved.
Yeah, I think that one of my advantages actually, bluntly, was growing up in the hood. I mean, my mom was from an upper class family, but she was actually an inner city school teacher, which I respect the hell out of. So I was born on the south side of Chicago. I grew up on the east side of nearby Aurora, which at the time was the murder capital of the country. And I wasn't a hood guy. I was an athlete, but I was a working class kid, and I was focused on things like helping the family earn money, how my date was going to go that Friday, sports, would I make it downstate, that kind of thing. And I mean, it wasn't until I got to college, and I've heard a lot of people say this, that I heard people way richer than me, that I would have thought of as preppy rich kids who just happened to be black from the next city over, tell me how oppressed they were. So I think coming from outside that perspective, and having known a lot of poor white and Hispanic kids in the hood in the Midwest, by the way, I just skipped over a great deal of this. And so it sounds like fantasy and excuse making to me. But yeah, Bob did a good summary of this. I mean, the way this would be explained is institutional racism. All black people in the USA have deeply learned to hate ourselves because of the presence of white supremacy in the background to such an unrelenting extent. So when black kids in a powerful black city, which say Atlanta makes well above the national average income, are still underperforming their poorer white classmates, despite being all taught by blacks, that's because black people have been taught to hate one another. The argument, if you're debating a hard leftist on this, the argument will never move away from racism. Like, we're going to swing to COVID at some point. If you look at any of the papers on COVID-19 comorbidities, what's going to make you die of a serious flu-like illness, number one is being very elderly. Number two is being overweight, asthma, so on down the line, nothing to do with race. Blacks are no more likely, just to put it in the, Steelman framework, no more likely to die than whites once you adjust for these things. But the argument will be made, well, the fact that black people are obese doesn't just mean that we have a fair amount of good food to eat now. It is racism. Whites feed us an unhealthy body image in rap videos. There are fewer stores in our neighborhood. So someone that really advocates this is never going to move away from the racism framework, at least in debates I've had, official and unofficial. And it's the weirdest thing.
So what we want to do in 1776, rather than engage in debate with the people on the other side, we want to show an inspirational and an aspirational alternative, because people are motivated to improve their lives when you give them victories. And so what we're doing through our essays is we want to be able to hand school children not a curriculum that denigrates the country and talks about its failures. America's birth defect was slavery, but who wants to be defined by a birth defect? But we should be supporting America's promise, not a defect. I ask groups all the time when I speak, how many of you want to be defined by the worst thing you ever did when you were a youngster? None of us do. And you know, I happen to be a Christian. And if every time that we read about the Apostle Paul, someone said, yeah, but you used to be Saul. And so I just think redemption is the definition of this country. Transformation and redemption, that we are a country of second chances. And so that's what 1776, we're going to be presenting examples of people who were born in slavery who died millionaires. We want to explain to our young people how the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940, it was 8th grade for whites and 5th grade for blacks. And within less than 20 years, that gap was closed within 6 months, because a Jewish philanthropist, Julius Rosenwald, partnered with Booker T. Washington, and they put up $4.8 million, and the black communities who selling chicken dinners and whatnot, they also raised $4.8 million and built 5,000 Rosenwald schools in the rural South, and where we were operating on budgets that were half of the money spent on white schools, yet we closed the education gap between 1920 and 1940 from within 3 years to 6 months. If we did that then in the midst of slavery and discrimination and Jim Crow, why can't we close the gap today in cities that are run by black educators? So, but you see, 1619 does not permit those kind of questions to be raised. 1776 provides answers to those questions. And so we want people to be inspired.
When we look at these opportunities to be inspired, you know, the 1619 project, okay, great, we'll put them aside. Let's talk a little bit more about the 1776 side of it then. Is it focused just on black versus white? It seems like we often get trapped into that.
No, there are two goals that we have. One is to deracialize race. To deracialize race, and also to desegregate poverty. The 10 lowest performing, poorest counties in America are white and Native American. They're not even black. So that's why we're inviting J.D. Vance, who wrote Hillbilly Elegy, who grew up in Middletown, Ohio. One of our other essayists, Clarence Page, who is black, award-winning, Pulitzer-winning a journalist, he wrote an essay. He's also from Middleton, Ohio. And so we're going to have an event this summer that will bring J.D. Watts and Clarence Page together, when we'll be filling the auditorium with blue-collar and working-class blacks and whites, and we will be talking about putting race aside and dealing with poverty. And so we have to demonstrate in our work that we are clear that the problem facing America, we need to put race aside because it's preventing us from getting at poverty. So again, we have white presenters, essayists, we have white grassroots leaders who are part of our coalition. So we have a combination of not just scholars like Will and others, but community activists that are people, some of them are ex-offenders, some of them are ex-drug addicts who, through God's grace, they have been redeemed, and they are witnesses that transformation and redemption are possible. So they are the ones actually implementing the values that our founders articulated in the Declaration of Independence. So in order for people to be recruited to America's finest ideals, it's not enough to give them information, but they must see demonstrated in their lives that these values can produce a superior life and a restored community. So that's what 1776 is going to be presenting through video, through presentation, through conferencing. We want to teach kids to look on the upside of America, not its downside.
I'll give you an example of the upside. But back in my Captain Morgan modeling days, we represented a lot of brands, and one of them was Ciroc vodka, and it was dead in the water. They had launched it. It was going nowhere fast. Sean Combs put his name behind it, and all of a sudden it was a leading brand in the vodka industry. Just like that, an entrepreneur came in and fixed the problem.
Yeah, and it's amazing. You see, but right now, the reason I say that the problem is not economic or racial, it's cultural. It's a moral and spiritual freefall that is consuming people from all over. The very fact that drug addiction and opiate deaths are occurring in places like New Hampshire, Northern Virginia, Plano, Texas, and areas. You got so many of these young white entertainers committing suicide or overdosing on drugs. That means that there is a moral and spiritual emptiness in a part of America that success and celebrity does not satisfy. And so what we are saying in 1776, is that mother in Silicon Valley, where Silicon Valley has about 95% of all households have a man and woman raising children, where the average education is a master's degree, with a median income of about $180,000. In that affluent community, the suicide rate among teenagers is 6 times the national average. So obviously, material success is not enough to fill that emptiness. So that mother who lost a 17-year-old daughter to suicide in Silicon Valley has more in common with the Black mother who lost her daughter, a 17-year-old daughter, to homicide in the inner cities, but they have more in common than they do in their differences. But we're never going to answer the question is, how do we fill that emptiness that's causing some people to take a life and others to take their own life? They're different sides of the same coin. But if we were able to put race aside, maybe we can bring that Silicon Valley mom together with the moms in the inner city, and let's try to find out what is causing these young people to experience such a feeling of emptiness, a lack of content, a lack of meaning in their life. So that's the greater challenge that we have, but we're not going to be able to answer those questions if we are divided by race.
Suicide rates are up 30% since 1999 per the CDC.
Yep. And this all, the spiritual element can be discussed, but I think this is something that a lot of political scientists, a lot of people on the military side, a lot of people have begun to notice. I mean, I don't know if you guys have read Bowling Alone, but there's a pretty famous, both of you gentlemen, famous book obviously came out past 20 years that pointed out that all of the things that used to give glue to the average, in particular, man's life have faded to a large extent. I mean, the percentage of people playing varsity sports in high school is down 50%. People are scared about the kiddos getting hurt. Percentage of people to participate in the military, which used to be mandatory for 4 years, that's down 95%. Pete might correct this. But as you go on in your life, what's the percentage of people that are getting married, that are in a happy traditional marriage? What's the percentage of people that even belong to the local bowling league? This is a national problem. It's not a black or white problem, but it's a problem of the traditional bonds and initiations that made adult life going away. And I will throw spirituality in here. What percent of people belong to a church and go regularly? But a number of other things, like I play regular competitive basketball. I mean, most people have been taking a break during the, disease crisis going on. I have, of course. But I mean, even that is a pretty selected percentage of people. So this issue of where does meaning come from, that's a national problem that doesn't have anything to do with being white or black. As you guys said, the one difference is that we noticed that for whatever reason, Caucasians are more likely to kill themselves, and African Americans are more likely to kill other young black people. But both those figures are very high. I mean, suicides, and that's a 79% Caucasian problem, by the way. Those are up over 45,000 a year, which is incredible. One of the major causes of death for young men now is killing yourself, specifically shooting yourself in the head. So that is a obviously negative, fixable characteristic of our society. And again, the broader idea, so a lot of these are national problems that don't have anything to do with race, that don't even necessarily have a lot to do with class. But where you do see class come in is that a lot of the things that are seen as race issues, in fact, have to do with broad economic trends. So there are things that don't affect all Americans, but affect people like by class. Illegal immigration is a problem that has a lot of class-based effects in the USA. So is automation. Jobs are vanishing. And the interesting thing seems to be poor whites have moved further right as a reaction to this. That's a lot of President Trump's base. Poor blacks and white city kids seem to have moved further left, and that's a lot of Bernie's base, for example. So you again get into something you've seen since the old plantation owners, which is that unified working class isn't unified. It's broken into two camps at the far extremes, and maybe that's how the people with money like it.
There's also an effect where I'm being bulldozed towards the right. I'm not, don't assign me a political bent or lean, but no matter what I do, I get jammed over this way, and I'm like, hey, hold on, get your hands off of my politics, So we're desperate to kind of divide ourselves, it seems like. What are your thoughts on that, Will?
Well, I mean, for me specifically, I agree with the first statement. I'm conservative in the sense that I have money and weapons. I mean, I've always thought of myself as kind of a business guy, to have a jacket on a fair amount of time. I'm not a radical. But if you asked me my honest thoughts on something like gay relationships, I mean, I really could care less. So that's been my basis, kind of a business center-right perspective. But coming from that perspective, I prefer almost any damn thing to communism. So I often do find myself, if you see the options are Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, we can look at policy a little bit. If you see that the options are AOC and Trump, I'm probably going to end up voting for the person that's not AOC. I mean, I have some ethical issues with Mr. Trump, President Trump, but I mean, that's the way most Americans are going to go, I'd say. So I do think you see this. I think what you see is that the extreme social justice left, I think this is a problem that begins on the left. Even the alt-right is a backlash to this. The extreme social justice left has begun defining almost everyone that is beyond conventional socialism as a Nazi. So, I mean, you see these crazy articles like Bill Maher, the troublesome right-wing uncle.
Oh, my God.
And Bill Maher is what I would think of as a classical liberal, up there on stage making jokes about smoking pot and dating models. I mean, he filmed a well-known atheist movie called Religulous, but he, too, is on the right. And I think that as the right gets defined as anyone but Bernie and AOC, I think more people are going to say, yeah, I might vote for Trump. I mean, I prefer him to a communist. Again, I don't view this kind of polarization as especially helpful. It's probably not ideal if the two options that you see on social media very often are social justice and the alt-right, but there it is very often right now. And again, to kind of segue back to mainstream, I do think movements like 1776 can help correct a lot of that. These very basic points, we're all Americans, class matters more than race. I think people will respond to that.
Well, I define my political philosophy as radical pragmatism. I just like stuff that works.
Yeah.
Yep.
And also, I look at relationships. Where I come down is I look at what is your strategic interest and whether or not your strategic interest is compatible with my strategic interest. John McKnight, one of the godfathers of the self-help movement and an old mentor of mine, John said he was building a cabin in Wisconsin, and his electrician was a drunk, and his plumber had one leg. But the value of these two men to him was in their skill. But if I were a person running an organization that helped the handicapped, my investment, I would only interested in their disability because I profit from their disability as opposed to someone who needs their skill. And so it doesn't matter how compassionate that person is who's running a disabilities organization. They need you to be dependent on that. And the very fact, and this is an uncomfortable statistic, 2 out of 10 whites with college education works for government. 6 out of 10 blacks with education works for government. So unfortunately, our professional middle class work in a sector of our society where they need low-income, disabled or dependent people to survive. And that's a situation that I never hear discussed, is so that we've got to look at what is the strategic interest. If you are an employer and you need 200 people to show up on time and work, and you're going to pay $15 an hour, and I'm running a program for people who need jobs, you and I have a basis of a strategic relationship. I don't care if you're racist.
I also don't care if you only got one leg. Can you do the damn job?
I don't care.
Yeah.
And so that's what we ought to be talking about. What are strategic relationships, and whether or not we have some basis upon which there is compatibility.
That's another logic versus moral point that you get into when you get into politics. What you see with social justice and a lot of the black left is the attempt to label certain things kind of off the charts, as in you can't interact with this person because he's done this thing and it's evil. And racism is probably the classic example of this. You see this all the time with Trump, for example, where the argument that blacks shouldn't vote for Trump is almost entirely couched in terms of things he said or allegedly said. So someone will say, well, this is a man that called Hispanics animals, although that's not quite accurate. That was a reference to MS-13. Or this is a guy who criticized Antifa fighters as much as neo-Nazis. How could you vote for a scumbag like that? And left out of these analyses is any question of who would economically be better for the black community or for other communities. I mean, under the Trump administration until quite recently, African-American unemployment was at its all-time low, lower than it had been while we're keeping records. So I think that pragmatic point of it would make more sense to ally with someone who you might not like, who you might think is a drunk or a womanizer or even a bigot, but who's going to help you achieve your goals and live your life as an adult man, than it would to ally with someone who says pleasant things but treats you like a child. That's something that's been almost lost in quote unquote cancel culture discourse. People can say the most obviously true things, but then be shut out by the mass media for being rude. So again, this is one of several points that are worth bringing to the light, that there are interests you have in life other than not being offended. In fact, anyone who's been, Pete, for you in the military, serious business, Bob, community organization, who gives a damn if someone offends you? The question is whether you can work with that person to get things done. But we're moving more and more and more away from that. And
I take the position that even a bigot isn't my worst enemy.
I tend to agree. Who is your worst enemy?
A traitor is.
No.
Like Kwame Kirkpatrick, the former mayor of Detroit, who's now serving over 18 years in prison, who turned the city administration into a cash cow and took the pension, stole some of the pension funds of thousands of black workers. He and 20 of his frat brothers and others are serving time for raping that city. To me, he is much worse. He's a traitor. He's much worse than any bigot. And so I say that a traitor is more, someone can be racist and right.
Well, except about the racism, presumably.
What?
I said except about the racism, presumably.
Right. I'm talking about just like a friend of mine had his house broken into, and we had this debate. And I said, if some racist was a witness and knew who stole it, would you not want his testimony in court?
Yeah.
And if he was willing to testify, I saw the person who did it, and I know, would you discount it? Oh, no, he's racist, so I don't want him to testify on my behalf in court. I mean, we got to be practical about these things. But again, I think people need to think about that. What is worse? Someone who is a moral traitor, someone who looks like you and gave you your vote, you gave them their vote with the promise that they would serve you, and they used that to serve themselves to your disadvantage. To me, they are a traitor, and traitors are worse than bigots.
What has the lady that founded the 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, What has her response been? Has she been a collaborator? Has she seen as you guys like advancing this narrative, or what's her response been? You see me teeing it up?
Yeah, but she's been, I don't know about you, Will, but I haven't heard anything from that side.
Well, I mean,
what they said to white historians, all your old white men, that's all. They discounted them. But I don't think they have responded to us, have they?
Sort of. You can see Hannah Jones's response on Twitter. I think it was Coleman Hughes that reached out to her. And as you know, Coleman, he's a young man finishing up undergrad studies, very polite young gentleman. He contacted Nicole Hannah Jones and said, I'm working with Bob Woodson, Will Reilly, Glenn Lowry. I mean, these legendary, I wouldn't describe myself as this, but these well-known individuals, thinkers. Would you be interested in something like a debate? And Nicole Hannah Jones responded by posting a picture of herself with a gold grill in. And posted on Twitter the comment, "This is my response to the 1776 project." And
I don't even know what it meant.
Yeah,
me neither.
It was just it was an insult. Like, these are, I'm from the street. These are some Uncle Toms or something. Like the person that commented first under it was like, "She grilling on y'all." And this whole thing got pretty ridiculous. I was tagged in it like 15 or 20 times. I actually have a red, white, and blue fanged grill from my days as the owner of a nightlife company. So I posted a picture with that and was like, serious debate goes on. But in terms of the response to Coleman's reach out, the response to some things Glenn Lowry has said, I mean, just discussing this on a well-known podcast, is Blogging Heads TV. People know who he is, what he's saying. I mean, I don't think that they've responded at all.
The National Constitution Center in Philadelphia invited me to debate her, or as they said, have dialogue with her before a national forum that was supposed to take place in April or May. I accepted, but I don't think she did. But because of the pandemic, I haven't heard anymore. But I accepted right away.
Yeah,
I have a historian on her side and a historian on my side. And they wanted us to have a public discussion. I accepted, but I haven't heard back. So. Yeah,
social justice warriors generally don't accept debate challenges. I don't want to stereotype too much, and I don't know if that describes everyone from 1619, but I mean, there's almost an art to it. Like, I've been asked to be the debate coach at a well-known historically black college. The team isn't exactly set up as of this moment, but I enjoy debates. I've debated everyone from Jared Taylor on the far right on over to the left, and the whole campus continues that tradition. We've had people like Tim Weiss, this time on the hard left, come and speak, come and debate students and so on. So, I've challenged a bunch of people on the SJW left, like, let's have a conversation. We're both well known enough to get on TV. Let's debate. And the general response is, response one is, I won't debate you because you're a Nazi/Uncle Tom, generally depending on your race. Response number two is, I don't want to give you visibility, although in every case this has been people I've been much better known than. Response number three is, I know my ideas are right and I don't need any challenge from, you evil people over there. I won't do your emotional labor for you. Anyone that spent time on Twitter has heard these responses. So no, I don't think that if myself or Bob were to say, I'll put $10,000 up to your favorite charity, meet me here, there'd be any response at all but a joke online. I will say, if anyone from 1619 wants to have a debate as polite as you want, some cameras in the corners, I'm perfectly open for that. I'd say Bob would probably be open for that. Don't want to speak for anyone. But I think in response to me just saying that right now, I'll challenge any of you guys to a debate, there will be just hushed whispers for months to come. I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, and I'll go one further. Anybody who wants to come on the show from the 1619 Project, I'll give you an open, fair platform to speak from, and there's no gotchas. Just curious as to your point of view, and a conversation with Will or whomever, Bob, whoever it is. I'm glad to host it.
Yeah, and it's weird. And now, again, no, this is a left-wing thing. Even the extreme right, like Jared Taylor, was very willing to debate me. I don't agree with him on anything. But the extreme left is very hard to bring into a debating salon. Ben Shapiro, the conservative commentator, does, as you guys know, the Sunday special, where once a week he invites people on for the, politest imaginable debates. and each one gets about 2-3 million views. This is a $500,000 opportunity. He asked every Democratic presidential candidate to come on and just argue with him. And the only one that said yes was Andrew Yang. The idea from all the rest was, no, I don't think that's appropriate. Words like Nazi came up. It's silly, but it's real. Like, they rarely debate. They usually don't.
I love when they call Shapiro a Nazi. That's just the best.
Kippah on and everything. Yeah, I mean, he's clearly an Orthodox Jew. I mean, he cancels 50 shows a year for the major Jewish holidays. Yeah. But these words have become absolutely meaningless. I mean, in terms of and I don't want to just say, online conservative guy cliches, but in terms of the conversation we had earlier, if you think blacks are better athletes and don't give them as many poisonous opiates, you're a racist. We've moved well beyond racist means, hey, don't sit there, Spanish boy. Not my opinion, of course, but to this sort of nonsense, everything is prejudice, everything is bigotry. And I think it's understandable that when you just straight up challenge somebody and say, hey, I think that's bullshit, will you come on a show with like me, Bob, Pete Turner, and Dan Crenshaw and debate it? It's not surprising that people say, no, I won't.
Yeah.
And a lot of them will slide into your text messages or your DMs and explain why, but they're rarely going to say it on a public platform, in my experience.
But let me just say a commercial. If anybody wants to know more about 1776, they can sure dial us up. It's 1776unites with an S.com. 1776unites.com. You'll see articulate people like Will and others there being interviewed. Their essays are there. They're very exciting. They're uplifting. They're informative.
Factually accurate.
And they're accurate. That's the main thing.
Well, and also I would say too, you guys are also prepared to be wrong and evolve your position into something else, and not afraid. Any great idea requires a rigorous challenge to it. No idea worth a damn can't withstand rigor. And that's the whole point about the debate is, can you stand there and learn something and get better at your position? You can't say that you already know, especially when you're not even 40 years old. You haven't got the first fucking clue about life. No one close to you has died. Your best friend hasn't had a divorce and had to live on your couch when you didn't even have a couch yourself. All those things that have to happen in life. Jesus Christ. Yeah. Slow down. Just seek to understand one another. That's my big point.
So anyway, we're excited about the future because we think that there are millions of parents out there who don't want to have their children indoctrinated with 1619. But I think among the worst things that I've heard in terms of racial profiteering, have you heard about a race to dinner?
Oh, yeah, that's unbelievable.
You heard about that one?
No,
yeah, my
I have not.
girlfriend.
A race for dinner, there's a black woman and an Indian woman who've teamed up. And what they do is they recruit 7 guilty white women who would be willing to host a dinner in their homes. They have to pay $2,500, and then they'll come in and they'll beat up on them to expose their racism. So far, they have had 50 outings, and they only want guilty white women. And they end up crying, and they're talking about, we're helping you to confront your racism and your privilege.
Oh my God.
And so Penguin just offered them a book deal.
The funny thing about this is that my partner, Jane, is an upper middle class, white looking, she's part native woman, and she was actually contacted about this. So the whole thing about race, according to her, I mean, I don't know the exact email sequence or whatever. A friend sent it to her. She was directly, hit up. But the whole race to dinner idea is that there is an Indian American woman, Saira Rao, and a black partner. I don't know her name offhand. And they are both utterly non-oppressed, upper class American women. But they will, as Bob said, hold these dinners where 10 guilty rich white women will sit there and be told how racist they are. So, like, for example, did you adopt a black kid? Why? Are you fetishizing black people? There are 10 or 15 questions that are used to start these conversations. Oh, you've got a black man, professional athlete. You think that means you can't be racist? The transcripts of these dinners are unbelievably hilarious. But Saira Rao recently signed a deal for the book race to dinner with like a big publisher. I think one of you guys said it was Penguin. I mean, like in contrast, I think
Penguin. I think it was. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But,
no, that's.
No, I mean, this is how anxious the left is to publicize this foolishness. Can you imagine? I'm in the wrong business, man.
It's like a dominatrix club for white ladies with no nudity involved. You just go in there and get mentally abused for an hour.
I've been a bad girl. I bet there's a substantial overlap between subbing and going to these dinners. That's all I'm going to say about that.
We are thinking about 1776. We want to be competitive in that race. So we're going to have 1776 reparation paddles.
Oh, yeah.
So that a wood paddle. So if you're feeling privileged, you can have a black friend give you a whack.
Bob, myself, and someone else with a sense of humor, I think maybe Talib once sat around thinking of BS like this we could sell to people who either white businessmen that have a sense of humor or businesswomen, of course, or just guilty idiots. But like one of the things was a white privilege card, which would just be a blank white plastic card that looks like a Visa. You could take it to the grocery store and see exactly what your privilege is worth on every purchase. I think that one was hilarious. Bob's was the reparations paddle. Yes. If you want to feel guilty, have a black friend strike you as hard as they can. If you happen to beat them at basketball or golf or whatever, that's the time to apologize, you know. But just all this stuff. And I mean, we're going to sell this stuff. And I think that there's a market for it because people are starting to get the joke. Yeah. Like, there are situations where it is appropriate to feel guilty. If I were a male, I obviously am, but if a female friend of mine told me she'd been sexually assaulted by a guy I knew, you would start to ask questions as a guy. Who are your friends? How can you be a better man? So on. Similarly, if you lived during the 1950s in America and you were white, a bit of guilt is appropriate. How can I help, Joe from the job really get his rights? Some of these same questions came up even with gay rights in the 2000s. But today, I think most people understand that Asian Americans and middle-class blacks and legal immigrants like Cubans are as wealthy as anybody else. And when you see an Indian woman in a $2,500 DKNY dress standing at the foot of a dinner table screaming at a bunch of submissive-looking white people, most people are going to react by saying, this is the most ridiculous damn thing I've ever seen, not by saying, how can I, punish my own privilege? A certain percentage of people are masochists. I mean, I've read figures as high as 15 or 20%. So there probably will be some people that keep flagellating themselves with this crap. But I think that what you're seeing from most people is a subsurface mockery of the whole thing, where no one has a Twitter account in their real name anymore. And when someone posts something woke, it's just people lolling and ridiculing it and saying things like, we was Kangs. And I don't necessarily approve of all that, but I think that's because people have gotten tired of the bullshit. Like, it's obvious to most people Saira Rao is not oppressed. She just got probably a $500,000 book deal looking at what Penguin normally puts out. In no possible context is someone in that position doing worse than the huge majority of the population. So people are starting to get it. You just can't say it in public yet.
Well, fellas, we said a lot in public here today, and we're over an hour, and I want to respect your guys' time. And Bob, thank you so much for coming on. It's always a treat to have someone new come on and express ideas. And look, for those of you guys who disagree, the comments are yours to put in there, and I'll play around a little bit with you guys, but I love it. I love what you're doing. I love that you're creating an opportunity to create a positive narrative around who we are and what it means to be an American, and to look at the DNA as a whole thing, not just some birth defect, as you called it, Bob. So I appreciate you guys both coming on.
Well, I appreciate having me, and I just enjoyed it. I always enjoy being with Will. I learned so much.